folks. Thank you so much for heading back downstairs. I think we're still trying to get a few people to come back. Thank you for joining our panel today, Building Future EV Charging in Cities. I'm really excited about this topic. As I mentioned, I'm new to Uber, but I'm very passionate about charging infrastructure. Ultimately, we know what we've got to do. We've got to get clean, convenient, and cheap charging infrastructure installed on a global basis, or we're really not going to be able to achieve our zero emission aspirations. But that's easier said than done. So I'm super excited about this panel today to talk about how we remove some of the barriers and how we really accelerate the deployment of charging infrastructure. But before we get to our expert panelists, I want to invite Emily Bowman up to set the stage for us a little bit about what we've been doing at Uber with partnerships and products.
Great.
Thanks, Emily.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca, and we're thrilled to have you on Team Uber. I'm Emily Bowman, Global Director of Sustainability Policy at Uber. At Go Get Zero last year, we convened experts to discuss the lack of urban charging infrastructure and the impact that this has on drivers using the Uber app. We discussed possible product partnership and policy solutions to address urban charging deserts. But before turning over to our esteemed panel, I just wanted to take a couple minutes to share a little bit about what we've been up to on the Uber side. On the product side, we've developed a suite of smart charging product features that help drivers decide when and where to drive or to charge to relieve key pain points like range anxiety or missing out on earning opportunities. We've integrated charging infrastructure data into our app so that drivers can easily see where they can conveniently charge without having to switch between apps. As you heard from Sachin, we've also developed battery-aware matching, where with drivers' consent, we factor in their battery charge into trip matching so that they're only shown trips that match their battery range. And we've also launched a charging widget that provides recommendations to drivers about when to charge so that they don't miss out on key earning opportunities. Beyond product, we know that partnerships remain critical to reducing charging deserts. Since Go Get Zero last year, I wanted to highlight a few exciting updates. Uber has invested in It's Electric, a New York-based charging company pioneering overnight curbside charging without any cost to the property owner or city. Also in New York, we're working with Revel to provide Uber drivers exclusive access and discounts to 250 fast charging stations through a first-of-its-kind arrangement where Uber is providing a utilization guarantee. And this, in turn, allows Revel to expand their network to underserved areas of the city. Now, on this side of the Atlantic, we're partnering with supermarket chain Carrefour to offer substantial charging discounts to drivers. And right here in London, we've invested £5 million to build 700 chargers across 3 London boroughs, focusing on areas where many Uber drivers live, but that were previously underserved by on-street charging infrastructure. Now, we launched that at Go Get Zero last year, and today I'm pleased to share that over 350 chargers have been installed. Now, some of you that were here last year, you might also recall that we shared a preview of Uber's proprietary EV charging demand model. This tool generates heat maps showing future demand for charging based on current and future Uber drivers using EVs. Since last year, we've shared these demand scenarios with dozens of cities, many of whom have leveraged the data to secure public funding for charging infrastructure programs. Now, we believe that stronger urban EV charging networks will make charging more convenient and affordable for working families and high-mileage drivers, and that this benefits cities. Our own research and external research shows that the average EV driver on Uber does about 170 trips per month. We see that drivers on Uber are 5 times more likely to switch to electric compared with the average driver, and that they can deliver up to 4 times the emission savings because they utilize their cars more. This also matters from an equity perspective. EV drivers on Uber are about 2 times more likely to represent lower income communities versus your average EV owner. Now, despite this progress and what you heard today, we know there's more work to do. We still hear from drivers that charging is too difficult. Access to charging is a major concern for a driver considering a switch to electric. Many drivers don't have access to overnight charging, which means that they have to stop and charge during the day between trips. And this lack of convenient and affordable charging puts a lid on EV adoption in cities. And we know these are barriers that Uber can't solve alone, and we know they're not unique to rideshare. That's why today we're thrilled to bring together a panel of experts to speak about this problem and really identify shared solutions that empower high-mileage drivers to continue leading the EV revolution. So I'll hand back to Rebecca to welcome the panel to the stage. Thanks. Thanks,
Okay. Come on up, new friends. The panel needs no introduction, but you can see their backgrounds here on the screen. Cassie, Colin, William, thank you so much for being a part of the panel. I'm really excited today, and I think the conversation is going to be helpful for us to really share perspectives across the industry and also think about what we at Uber here can do to help more. So let's jump right in. Okay, awesome. Maybe let's just set the stage a little bit about what's been happening over the last year for charging infrastructure. So Colin, for you, we'll have you start and invite the other panelists to chime in as well, but how have investments in charging infrastructure been going for the last year? What areas around the globe are leading? And what can we learn from those areas, and what are the limitations or what's slowing down deployment?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is that there is more charging infrastructure being installed now than ever before. And having Rebecca ask me that as someone who's probably responsible for helping catalyze more charging infrastructure than any one person in the world is an interesting place to be. But certainly what we're seeing is that, just to put some numbers behind it, there was about 600,000 public charging points installed globally in the first half of this year, heading for about 1.3 million new charging points globally in 2024. Now, it won't surprise anybody to know that a lot of that is in China, where more than 50% of vehicle sales are now plug-in vehicles. But it's also, the next area down is Europe, and we're also seeing pretty rapid growth there too. So in Europe, just to zoom in on public fast charging networks, there's about 89,000 ultra-fast public chargers in Europe. That's a 7-fold increase from where we were just in 2021. So a huge increase in the amount of public charging infrastructure. And just to zoom in on the UK, about half of all the public chargers in the UK on the fast side were built in the last 18 months. So we are at this really, really steep part of the curve. And sometimes you hear people trot out talking points about, from the automakers in particular, about how we can't do this because the charging infrastructure is not ready. We definitely need more charging infrastructure, but a lot is really happening right now. And certainly on the investment side, we're seeing that. Another thing that we're seeing is growing recognition of the viability of the business model for charging. So again, a few years ago, you would hear people talk a lot about how you need to be in another ancillary business in order to want to get into charging, maybe because it's helping sell cars. Now what we see is that as you get across this chasm of utilization, and you get utilization up enough, then there's a real return on those assets. So you see that in places like the Netherlands and Norway. And then lastly, just coming to what are the barriers. One of the big barriers, and I work a lot with electric utilities. We're teams of industry analysts and data providers serving automakers, utilities, energy companies in their journey to a low carbon economy. One of the things we work a lot with is electric utilities. They are all very aware now that grid connections are a huge issue. This has been one of the biggest issues, and it was sort of, when you heard people talk about it, felt like they were shouting into the void a bit. Just in the last 12 months, a lot of the electric utilities have started to really recognize that they have a role to play in removing some of this barriers, staffing up the groups that do permitting, all these sorts of things. We're seeing real movement there as well. So I feel relatively optimistic based on what we've seen in the last little while, but of course there's still a lot more work to do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with some of your comments more. I mean, just to put a point in it, and this is all public information. As I mentioned earlier, I'm most recently at Tesla building out our charging infrastructure. That was way too kind of a comment, but that is my background. And just to put a point in these regional differences, we really tried to focus and invest the same across the different regions at Tesla, China included. And the percentage of infrastructure that was Tesla in the U.S. or North America was 60. This was a couple months out of date, but I think it still holds. About around 60% of infrastructure from Tesla. Here in Europe, that's 20%, and that's significantly dropped over the last 5 years because of the investment here. Go all the way over to China, less than 1% was from Tesla. So when you think about entrance and how helpful it is to have more people, more companies, more governments pushing, really, really important that multiple players are in the regions and really trying to install, great charging infrastructure.
And yeah, in the U.S. on that point, we're seeing there's about 1,000 public charging points being installed a week now in the U.S. Again, a huge increase from where we were just a little while ago.
Yep.
And you're starting to see real money starting to flow. The NEVI program is now allocating billions. That money's just going out the door, and you're going to see that being used to actually deploy chargers in the next little while, and bringing quite a wide variety in. When we look at who's winning money in that, some of it's convenience stores, some of it's quite some players that maybe you didn't think of as being active in charging. So again, that's all pretty positive. It all still needs to go faster, but it's all moving as well.
Yeah. If we have time, I'd love to come back to moving things faster and how long the timelines are for charging infrastructure, which is a really critical, challenging piece of everything. But let's keep moving. William, next one for you. Let's talk about policy. So do we have the right policies in place? Do we have the right policies in place in the EU and also at the national levels here in Europe to support the transition to electric mobility? Can you tell us about the opportunities and gaps you see?
Yeah, I mean, let me first say that I'm very happy to be here. A couple of years ago, when we had a big discussion about forcing car makers to go electric, because that's what some of the policies we adopted in Europe do, people said, car maker lobbyists said, this is never going to work because there's not going to be any charging. I drove around Europe with my 2 kids in the back, so it wasn't exactly pleasant, but I did 5,000 kilometers across 7-8 countries, and I can tell you that at no point charging was a problem. And I think this is the experience of most EV drivers in Europe today, that charging is, yes, it is not perfect, but it is not a major obstacle, especially in, let's say, the main markets in Central Western Europe. So last year you have a 60% increase in charging actually the first half year of 2024. So we're doing really, really well. Now, we are currently at about 14% new electric vehicle sales in the EU. We're at 20% or so in the UK. We're doing really well. 5 years ago, we were below 2%. Of course, the challenge is we need to go to 100% in the next 10 years. So do we have all the right policies in place? Do we have all the answers right now? I don't think so. Of course, we will need to do more. But I think the big lesson for me of the last years is that charging and electric vehicles, they develop together. So the charging industry is a business. So they will invest where they see that a market will develop. And that's why in places like France, Germany, the Benelux countries, the Nordics, charging is really good because there's companies that see that they'll be able to sell a lot of electricity in the next 5 to 10 years. And I can tell you more about specific policies that we think work really well, but I think this is kind of the main message.
Yeah, and I think there's a point there. I mean, Sachin earlier kind of talked about this green flywheel, right? That positive momentum continues to move, and unfortunately I think the opposite can be true, right? The chicken and the egg problem with charging infrastructure and EVs, and as we think about companies in the private sector, that early investment period before you do get to the utilization is really challenging. So figuring out policies that we can kind of help the private sector get over that early hump, or things that we can do to make sure the utilization is there, will require or start to invite more investment, I think, from the private sector too. So I get kind of excited about things or policies or initiatives that kind of focus on that early stage, because then once they do get the utilization, it is really attractive. Still expensive from a CapEx standpoint, but really attractive from a profitability standpoint.
Yeah, and I think if you look at some countries in the EU that are not doing well, Poland, Italy, Spain, you see it's not just a matter of the grid is not ready. It's really a matter of there is no comprehensive policy to promote electric vehicles, and you need to do all these things at the same time.
Yep, absolutely. Cool. Okay, Cassie, let's shift to you. So tell us about the view from mayors' offices and your network on the electric transition and charging specifically. And probably a question I wanted to ask: what do we need to do to get more attention from those offices? What can we do to help?
Yeah, great questions. And thanks very much for having me here and joining this panel. We've heard some great things so far. I'm Cassie and I'm from C40, which is a network of nearly 100 of the world's largest cities, so true global network of the mega cities, who are all coming together to take ambitious climate action. And I think I'll pick up in a minute on some of these long-term policy signals and frameworks that mayors and cities can really help to set, I think, and kind of send a confidence signal. But maybe before we start talking about how electric charging infrastructure is a priority for cities, I maybe wanted to start with what some of the entry point for cities will be. And this is some of the big issues that are facing cities. And those are things like health issues, like global air pollution levels, and basically the unacceptability of these kind of levels of air pollution that are being faced around the world. And I think there is now no urban area, bar a couple of smaller ones, that has air quality that meets the World Health Organization guidelines. And many cities, around 41% of cities around the world, have air quality levels that are 7 times what the World Health Organization says is acceptable. So, solving that problem and ensuring that the most vulnerable in cities, those who are going to suffer from air pollution the most, children, elderly people, people with pre-existing health conditions, that's a priority of mayors, right? That is not okay that their citizens are putting up with that. So what do they do about it? Well, one of the main policies that a mayor would then take is to look at how they would really achieve sustainable transport within their city. So maximising walking and cycling, public transport, high mileage vehicles, and electrifying the rest of the vehicles. So I just want to set some of that context, because that's how you get in with a city office as well, right? That's how we actually start to talk to politicians, to mayors, to say this is truly important for you. And therefore, what are you going to do about charging infrastructure, which is totally necessary and needs a public intervention, listening to all of you as well, needs some of that public intervention to be able to maybe get things started, and then you can start to bring in, the private sector at scale. So I think this is a really, crucial issue. We're definitely seeing a number of leading mayors across cities in the C40 network, but beyond, who are really taking action on EV charging infrastructure. I'll give you an example. Mayor Wu of Boston has set a target that every resident in Boston will be a 10-minute walk away from an EV charger by 2030. Now, nobody's going to really time the 10 minutes, right? But the point is setting the ambition that says Boston is wanting to massively increase the deployment of EV charging across the city, and wants to do that through public-private partnerships, wants to take where the public sector can lead through reducing permitting times, opening up incentives for installing chargers on public land, for example, but also setting that long-term signal, I think, for the private sector to come in. So that's kind of one of the examples. I think we have another example in the city of Delhi in India, where the city has kind of made a one-stop shop for all permitting and approvals around EV charging points across the city. These are the kind of things that cities here and that we in the C40 network here are key barriers to overcome, to be able to then accelerate that deployment, even beyond some positive signals I'm agreeing with my colleagues here that we're already seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. And something you said about Boston there makes me want to go on a little bit of a tangent here and just talk about, what charging infrastructure feels like, to actual individuals. So I'm going to ask, how many folks have an EV or... Yes, good. Okay, great. I love it. So maybe a question
for who doesn't have a car at the same time, though.
Oh, even better. That's right. That's a good point. Even better. So my question is, to the panel is, even in areas, and I think, William, you mentioned like infrastructure, we are seeing, most, let's say, European are feeling like when they're going on road trips, they are having an infrastructure there. Even in areas where we do have infrastructure, are there still opportunities? Is it good enough? How is the reliability? Is it convenient enough? Are there still things that we need to work on even once we have the infrastructure to really take it to the level that we need?
I can give one opening comment on that, just that it's very easy. I'm a data guy. We like counting things. Counting how many things have gone into the ground is a lot easier than counting exactly how reliable they were over time. But so it is useful to say, look, there are this many stakes in the ground. But the next phase after that is very much, what's the uptime? What's the payment experience? And those two in particular are ones where there's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
So when we talk about equity of access and this sort of thing, you're playing to a much more tech-savvy crowd if the road trip requires 15 different apps, right? If you want to get into a less tech-savvy crowd, a less wealthy crowd, maybe you need to simplify that a little bit. You can't ask everybody to do that. You can't ask everybody to be an enthusiast. So certainly, those are probably the two areas I think need the most work. Still, reliability of uptime, which I will say in Europe is actually pretty good across the networks. In the US, it hasn't been as good outside of the Tesla network. And then payment. And payment right now there's been a lot of work done on this. T&E has pushed for really good policies on this. It's still quite a patchwork. And that is some of the growing pains of an industry. But certainly we want to get that towards a more streamlined solution sooner rather than later, because each time there's somebody who goes out with a really bad experience and shares it, that's kind of a lost opportunity to convert people. That's kind of a negative publicity moment that each time those kind of build up and can accumulate if we're not careful. So certainly I think there does need to be a focus on that across the board. And again, William's organization has done a lot of work to push for that.
Yeah. I mean, let me talk about a policy that we have at EU level, which is called the AFIR. AFIR, it's a boring acronym, but it basically says every 60 kilometers on European big roads, you need to have a charging station. I think that is really a great policy. And I think if I talk to American colleagues, they ask, how can we replicate this in the United States? Well, I don't know about that, but that works. What that gives you is a basic charging network. What you want going forward is you want ubiquity. You want an abundant charging network, so you don't have to think about it anymore. And as part of that, I think you talked about payment methods, but a big issue that we have right now is price. Just anecdotally, I charge at a Tesla station. Many people don't know it's opened up, but you can go there, 30 cents per kilowatt hour. It's amazing. I mean, it's basically the price I pay at home. Then I go to some oil company charger, I pay €1. So there is an issue there with competition. I think in your policies, and the role of government is important. You want to promote abundance, but you also want to promote competition, and you want to make sure that on prime locations, along highways, in cities, you don't give one operator a monopoly, because what that monopolist will do is, he will make you pay a lot of money. So that's I think something, for the next stage of charging development, we need to get deeper into those types of things. And I'll give you just one more example. We've been looking at a lot of tendering policies and subsidy policies. Governments often they have good intentions, but they end up doing the wrong things. They are, for example, very specific about where they want a charger. So I need a charger there, and I'm willing to give you lots of money to build one. So what happens? The person that owns the land says, well, I'm going to increase my rent by the exact same amount as the government subsidy. That's the kind of stupid stuff you don't want to do. So you need to be smart in your policy.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think, some of these topics are maybe second level, and I talk to the team all the time about, progress over perfection. So certainly the first step is getting the post in the ground, but I think it's important to have the vision of there are other considerations once you get to that piece. What's the next step do we need to be thinking about? So thanks for your comments there.
If I can just say one more thing, like also in public policy, we need, simplicity is almost more important than perfection.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Might be an unpopular opinion, but in the U.S. with some of the NEVI funds, a lot of the requirements for those funds are very, very difficult.
And so slows you down.
Exactly, just slows you down. And actually, I think some of the regulations in Europe we had a lot easier time with because there was more flexibility. So, I think we have to be very careful about what policies we recommend. Okay, I'm looking at my time. Let's talk about, and I think maybe Colin, you touched on this a little bit around equitable infrastructure. So traditionally, I think we all know the infrastructure that has been invested in has come to more affluent areas. So how do we ensure that we're balancing our investments for all drivers? And are there best practices that you guys have seen, or clear obstacles or ways that we maybe stumbled a little bit in the past?
Yeah, do you want me to go? Yeah,
Go ahead, please.
Fully agree. I mean, we definitely have seen that across a number of cities where you've seen more affluent areas kind of coming together. Firstly, I think some of the approaches that we've talked about today and you heard from this morning where, for example, Uber's approach of this combination of technology, incentives, and then policy, this is where you can start to see large, widespread scaling and deployment of charging infrastructure rather than it just going from where is it easiest for us to install, where have we got the most space, and so on. So I think that's also that kind of looking across those three and using the technology that we have as well and the data that we have to be able to then drive some of those investments. We've seen some great partnerships in cities. The city of Barcelona, who own and operate part of their utility as well, are partnering. And the great thing about working at a city level, I think, is the city's knowledge of where its people are. You know, the city knows, okay, where have I got lower income communities? Where are my multifamily dwellings? Where they can help do that kind of mapping with then utilities, but also charging providers to be able to then map that out. And so we're seeing that, yeah, Barcelona is a great example of that. London has done that well as well, where it's kind of opened up priority pockets of land, taking on board William's points of sometimes that can also have an unintended consequence of then subsidies going up. But I think that real targeting and using the knowledge within cities and policymakers to help drive those investments.
Yep.
I can give one that I think has come up with the Uber team as well. When we talk about the high mileage driver and there being a disproportionate opportunity there to reduce CO2 emissions much faster than if it's only going to private drivers. Is this question of how is electricity from chargers taxed? So if you're not aware, a public charging network you will have to pay a 20% VAT on electricity dispensed from that. But a home charger will generally pay 5% VAT, so on the electricity that you're getting there. And if you think about who that impacts, anybody who can charge at home generally has off-street parking and a way to charge that. They generally have a higher income. The people who don't have off-street parking generally have a lower income, and that is disproportionately impacting them, disproportionately impacting their ability to go electric. So when we've looked at this in quite a few markets, the high mileage drivers, if they can charge at home, they're already all in on electrification. They love it. But then you get to the ones who don't have a home charger, they're looking at the public charging network and doing the math, and they're quite sophisticated in this. I'm sure many of the Uber drivers are very, very sophisticated in how they think about this. They look at it and they go, well, the public charging networks are really expensive. So there are these little public policy things you can do around changing the VAT to equalize what you would pay for charging in public versus charging at home that can have an outsized impact on who has access to electrification as a way of either running their business or for their personal car.
Yeah.
I mean, first, I would say that it's good news that we're now talking about charging deserts because it shows we're making a lot of progress. It shows, we're talking about the harder parts of the transition. I think there's three things that I would recommend. One is a very simple form of subsidies. If you build a charger in region A, you get amount X. If you get more money if you build in another region. That's a bit the way the European fund works, and that's actually very simple. That's really easy to administrate. So that's one. The other thing, what I see working in some cities is that you have basically a CPO that has a deal with the city, and everybody that requests a charger in their street or in their neighborhood simply gets one, and that's a deal between the city and a CPO. That works really well. It's like the right to plug, but then on street. And the third one, which is the most boring, but actually one of the most important ones, is there's a thing called the renewable energy regulation or directive in Europe. In the UK, it's like the RTO, I think. And what you need to do is you have renewable fuel obligations on oil companies. You need to make sure that they can comply by selling or buying electricity. Okay. What that does, and maybe you can explain this better than I, but what that essentially does is it creates a transfer of money from the oil industry to whoever is building charging infrastructure. That makes a difference of a few cents per kilowatt hour, which actually makes a difference between business cases or not. Absolutely. And that's, if you're Uber, you need to get behind this, including in the UK.
Absolutely. Thanks. Thank you, William. Okay, I'm looking at my time, so let's do one wrap up, and I'm going to channel my Shailene from earlier with my optimism. I'm also an optimist. So what I want to ask is, what gives you hope? I think we've already heard a little bit of hope of what's happened over the last couple of years, but what are you seeing? What are some specific signs that really gives you hope that we're going to be able to build the infrastructure, not only the amount, but the quality that's needed to really push the transition forward?
Yeah, what gives me hope is the political leadership we're seeing, particularly from mayors. We're seeing mayors going further and faster than national governments on many of these issues. And we have around 35 of cities in the C40 network, so of the world's largest cities, that have committed to a significant part of their city being a zero-emission area by 2030. This is going to rely on huge investment in charging infrastructure and working closely with the private sector. And we're already seeing cities moving towards this and really making this happen. So I always like the mixture of ambition, but also action, right, that we can actually see it. And that action on the ground gives me hope.
Awesome, gentlemen.
You go ahead.
There's so much reason to be hopeful. I mean, like we used to complain that electric cars were too expensive, and now we're taking policy action because they're too damn cheap, right? That's what the tariffs do, right? So we've made phenomenal progress. I remember we had a conference back in 2018 where we were trying to convince EU regulators that they should set a target to phase out combustion engines. At the time, this was a crazy idea. Like now, we're actually on track. I mean, maybe, but there's still a bit of discussion about it. But I think it's going really well, actually.
I would say a technology part of it, and it isn't directly about the charging infrastructure, but it's about the batteries. So my team looks a lot at what's going on batteries. And what you've seen over the last decade is they've plummeted in cost. They're down about 90%. And then this year, battery prices are down even further. So an average battery cell right now for a lithium iron phosphate cell in China is going for about $50 a kilowatt hour. At the pack level, that's about $70 a kilowatt hour. Somewhere between 70 and 100 is where you can make a cost-competitive internal combustion engine vehicle, or a cost-competitive EV with an internal combustion engine vehicle. So that wave is absolutely coming. That part of what's driving the transition is not letting up. It's getting stronger. And so a lot of this, my view is that a lot of this is going to happen, but we need to make sure that it happens in the way we want it to happen. It's a bit like when you look in the US, you have a lot of a really big pickup truck market. You have this real problem with trying to electrify those because the vehicles have gotten so much bigger over the last little while. So you do need to steer things in the right direction, but the overall trend of electrification isn't going anywhere, and there's a lot more affordable models that are coming. A lot of automakers have timed the launch of their affordable models to next year in Europe because that's when the CO2 regulations tighten. They get tighter every 5 years, as William knows very well. And the automakers in the year before that will say, well, actually, I'm going to hold back launching until I'm in one of these years where it's gotten tighter. So there's a bunch more affordable electric models that are hitting the market, and that creates this constituency. And those constituents then ask their elected leaders to do more on charging infrastructure. So it doesn't happen on its own, but the trend is your friend, and things are going in the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would just add that I think the momentum is there, and maybe from a private sector side, the idea that charging infrastructure providers are now being able to build an actual business case because of the utilization. I mean, that really does create momentum. So with that, thank you so much to our panelists.
Thank you.
Cassie, Colin, William, so nice meeting you, and thank you for sharing your perspectives. And thank you to all of you for joining our panel here today. And hopefully we'll see you next year at this event, and we'll say that the momentum has even grown since this year. So lots of work to do to get there. Thank you. Thank you, panelists.